I kindly ask that everybody have their seats, please, as we get ready to commence the program. Thank you. Distinguished guests and fellow alumni, on behalf of the London School of Economics and Alumni Association here in Ghana, the Bank of Ghana, and the publishers, the Ghana edition Digibooks, I would like to thank you all for coming here today to join us for this significant occasion. It is important to mention that our interest as a fraternity and as collaborators is stemmed from both national and international affairs ongoing. And so as an association, we sometimes meet over drinks like this and indulge in topical issues. Our association's presence here today also stems from the fact that the author, Mr. Ivor Ajimendua, is one of us, which makes this a particularly special occasion for us all. Last year, when we got to know that he was writing this book, we tried to get him to speak about it. He did not. At best, he told us that 8 of the economic advisors of our economy since 1957 till date, the great Sir Arthur Lewis, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in economics, and another great who worked with him, J.H. Mensah, and 4 other governors had been trained at the LSE. And that if indeed there had been problems with our economic management to date, he jokingly told us that LSE could not totally escape any blame. He also told us that at least 3 governors, former governors, led by J.H. Frimpong Ansah, were attached to the development economics model of the school, and they had practiced it. They also ensured that one of the British economists that included the LSE one-time director, Sir Sidney Kane, was inducted as an honorary fellow into the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. It was partly based on this revelation that the association last year proposed to the LSE that the present governor, Dr. Ernest Addison, visit the University of London to give a pre-publication lecture on this book, whose European edition was published by the Hawkes Design and Publishing of the United Kingdom. This talk happened to coincide with the 65th anniversary of the Bank of Ghana, and the governor spoke on old and new challenges that central banking in West Africa, which immediately followed with a forum whereby included the representatives of the UNDP, Dr. Angelo Lusigi, Professor Piroski Nagy, then who was a visiting scholar at the LSE. The event was moderated by Dr. David Luke, and also, as fate would have it, Professor Lusigi cannot attend right now, but she will be coming here today. Today's reception is formally to welcome this book and to congratulate both Mr. Ivor Ajimendua and the Bank of Ghana, who have allowed for the independent history of the bank to be written at a time where world central banks live in apprehension. Our belief is that the significance of knowing and understanding the financial and historical critical issues can avoid repetition of things that have previously gone wrong. And from a knowledge of such a book as this, we can also understand how to get nation building right. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the former president, His Excellency John Agyekum Kufuor, as well as some of the country's accredited ambassadors and high commissioners. That include the Kenyan High Commissioner, the British High Commissioner, and the Charge d'Affaires of the Rwandan High Commission. I would like to welcome the UNDP representatives and congratulate them for their participation in this event and confirming their attendance. And to other distinguished guests and fellow alumni, I'd like to say welcome. I would also like to extend appreciation to Chief Kufuor and the African Region Hotel for hosting us today and supporting us to put together this event. Without much further ado, I'd like to invite my colleague and fellow alumnus, Gertrude, to come up and open the rest of this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seydou. Good evening, His Excellency, distinguished ladies and gentlemen who have joined us for the launch of this very historic book. Permit me to stand on the protocols already established by my colleague Seydou here and to welcome all of us here once again. My task here is to introduce some very distinguished personalities who have joined us this evening as special guests. But before I do that, I'd want to let us all know that this event is also being streamed live on the social media platforms of the Bank of Ghana, so on YouTube, Facebook, and I believe on Twitter. so you can also follow live from there. The first guest I'd like to introduce us to this evening is Our Lady Companion. Yes, Our Lady Companion of the Garter, who represented, for those of us who followed the coronation of King Charles III, that ancient order. She's currently Master, University College of Oxford, and she's the first black head of an Oxford college. Yes, I believe that deserves some applause. Thank you very much. As the British press reminded us, she became the first woman head of a British university when she was appointed director of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London in 2015. In diplomacy and international affairs, she was the 8th United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, prior to which she served as a British High Commissioner to Australia. She had also been advisor to many world leaders and organizations, including Nelson Mandela. In 1997, she made a huge jump in British politics and aristocracy when she was created a life peer serving as leader of the House of Lords and Lord President of the Council. From the year 2003 to 2007. She was appointed Secretary of State for International Development in May 2003 and became, again, the first Black, Asian, and minority ethnic woman to serve as a cabinet minister. Please help me show some appreciation to Baroness Valerie Amos. Thank you very much. Our next special guest, whom I'd want to introduce to us, is currently the first Deputy Governor of the Bank of Ghana, and he's a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. He had prior to this worked at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, rising through the ranks to the level of Deputy Division Chief and Mission Chief. He was the Deputy Division Chief in the Regional Studies Division in the African Department, where he led and supervised the production of one of the IMF's flagship publications, the Regional Economic Outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa. In addition, he also served as a mission chief for Mauritius, where he led policy discussions on a wide range of issues, including the financial sector, microfinancial linkages, fiscal and monetary policies, and growth strategies. He previously worked in the Strategy, Policy, and Review Department of the IMF. According to Ivor Central Banking in Ghana and the governors, he is the longest serving since Amonikwe and Paul Akwa to be Deputy Governor. Please put your hands together for Dr. Maxwell Opoku Afari. Thank you, Doc. Thank you very much. Our next guest who I'll be introducing is currently the Secretary General of the African Research Universities Alliance. He was before then the Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana and had served as Senior Fellow and Director of the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institutions in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, he was Director of the Institute of Statistical, Social, and Economic Research at Legon. He previously taught economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. He was a visiting scholar at Yale University and also at Swarthmore College. He's author, editor of over 10 books, including The Economy of Ghana, Analytical Perspectives on Stability, Growth, and Poverty, and the Oxford University Press publication, The Economy of Ghana, 60 Years After Independence. Please help me welcome Professor Ernest Aite. We are also joined here today by a gentleman who is currently the Chief Economist and Director of Research at the African Union's African Export and Import Bank, Afrexim Bank, based in Cairo, Egypt. He's a trained research economist. He was senior country economist at the World Bank Group and was also responsible for the macroeconomic and growth program at the World Bank Institute, the knowledge and research arm of the World Bank Group. He's founder of the Nelson Mandela Institution for Knowledge Building, and the advancement of science and technology in sub-Saharan Africa, an independent, groundbreaking African initiative to enhance the development of Africa through the promotion of excellence in science, engineering, and their applications. He is in the person of Dr. Hippolyte Fofack. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. At this point, I'd like to welcome the man of the hour, the man who is the reason why we are all here this evening to share some welcome remarks with us. Please put your hands together and let's welcome Mr. Ivor Ajimandua.
It is a great pleasure to have such a distinguished audience. Institutions have defined the good society, but when in upset conditions, they could show us some dangers as well. Some of you have built institutions, inherited and sustained others, or even used prototypes in new creations. Recollections of them, as you know, may differ, but they are recollections all the same. That could explain your appreciation for the memoirs of central banking and governance in Ghana, which bank was also the first in sub-Saharan Africa from 1957. The idea for this book did not come from the Bank of Ghana, but was accepted by it. It was agreed to be independently written to the extent that nothing would be agreeable by way of interpretation, at least not everything. For a conservative central bank built on the traditions of the Bank of England, this was a progressive step. Of course, at 65, and if one could ever be matured, it should show in that age or never. The bank today, as it agreed, totally opened its doors and even sponsored with grant, which enabled me to hire the services of a visual anthropologist, Jacob Marley, who worked on the photography and currency images. There were discoveries as much from the bank's own records, conversations, and observations of routine mechanisms as were its security storages. It took me to the British Museum in London when I was working on the chapter on currencies, and to the Bank of England itself, where the first English governor of the Bank of Ghana had trained, and who was later replaced after Nkrumah appointed a German economist and professor as the second governor. In the course of concluding the manuscript, the historical insights deepened. The features of the Ghanaian economy from last year were as if we were in 1965. If one read the World Bank report of 58 years ago, and what we went through in the last 12 months over expenditure on capital projects, domestic and foreign borrowing, outstanding debt repayments, negative energy economics, low exports and imports ratios, of import covering standing of weeks, they were mostly fiscal decisions tipping the scale. And the recommendations from the IMF had been the same over the years. Either we don't change in our ways and byways, or the fund does not change. From late 1969 to early 1970s, when the Minister of Finance, J.H. Mensah, and the Governor of the Bank of Ghana, J.H. Frimpong Ansah, led the Busia government's negotiation with the British government, including the Bank of England, we have walked in the shadows of 1965, which partly accounted for the end of Nkrumah's era. It is in honor of the past and the grace of the present to have one of the survivors of that negotiating team with us, former President Kufuor, who was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time. The other survivor not present here is Professor Nana S.K.B. Asante. The results of 2 years of research, of travel, at the feet of witnesses and forebears of histories is this book. It is published by Hackers Design and Publishing in England for the United Kingdom and American markets, the Digi Books edition in Ghana, and a Nigerian edition by Bookcraft in Ibadan. I must register my deep appreciation to these publishers. Governor Addison's approval of an independent history of the bank made many things easier for the cooperation of former governors and their families, those who share their papers or family memoirs out of which new perspectives emerged. Some of them, board members of the bank, formal and some senior management members, others, children like Kojo Frimpong Ansa and sister, children of the late Frimpong Ansa. I will, however, like to single out the secretary of the bank, Madam Sandra Thompson, not so much because we worked with her department, as a personal interest in history and its preservation. It was very critical to this work. The independence of writing that was extended to the altar had an appendix of which distinguished individuals will do the honors of the day, that is today. The lady companion of the Galta, Baroness Amos, obviously one of the most distinguished in contemporary British and world affairs, has a tight diary of engagements in Accra, but is still with us. Professor Ernest Aite, one of our leading economists, the chief economist of the Continental Export and Import Bank, Dr. Fofack, and of course, President Kufuor, whose tenure added up to this history. The former UN Economic Commission for Africa's Executive Secretary and President of the Africa Center for Economic Transformation, Dr. K.Y. Amwako, who I have worked with over the years, is also with us. Finally, to the LSC alumni for partly hosting this, and also to the other alumni group, I think so, as some of them must be here, who I guess are here more to see their former director, Baroness Amos, than to listen to what we have to say. And to all of you, I must say thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Ivo. I believe we can do this for him once again. Let's put our hands together for him again. Congratulations, Ivo. So we'll be taking some remarks from our distinguished guests who have joined us this evening. But before that, I think I've committed a very grave error, which I would have to ask for forgiveness from His Excellency here. Yes, a number of the speakers have already mentioned that we are joined by former President of the Republic of Ghana, but I think I'd want us to give him a very special recognition this evening. Please put your hands together for His Excellency John Agyekum Kufuor. Thank you so much for joining us, Papa. Okay, so I'd want to introduce, or welcome, rather, Dr. Maxwell Opoku-Aferi, First Deputy Governor of the Bank of Ghana, to share some remarks with us. Please put your hands together for him.
Vertically challenged. Thank you very much. His Excellency, President John Agyekum Kufuor, former President of the Republic, Baroness Valerie Amos, Master, University College of Oxford, and former Lord President of the House of Lords, UK, former governors and deputy governors, members of the Board of Directors of the Bank of Ghana, Dr. Hippolyte Fofack, Chief Economist, Afrasian Bank, members of the Ghana Association of Bankers, heads of departments and staff of the Bank of Ghana, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is a great pleasure indeed to be here, and thank you very much for the kind invitation, my good friend, to join you in the launch of this book entitled Central Banking in Ghana and the Governance, Institutional Growth and Economic Development. I think the emphasis of the title is very relevant. It's not just central banking in Ghana, but central banking in Ghana and the governance. The bank accepted, I think over time we understand why he added and the governance. The bank accepted to be part of this book launch because primarily it focuses on the central banking in Ghana, the key roles played by successive governors towards the achievement of the bank's objects and long-term sustainability, and ultimately the economic development of Ghana. Ladies and gentlemen, let me commend the author, Mr. Ivo Agyeman-Dua, who has written extensively and contributed to several publications, and this time the focus is on the world of central banking in Ghana. The bank is indeed supportive of the book's publication due to its contribution to the literature on central banking in Ghana, with emphasis on monetary policy and regulatory and supervisory operations of the bank. We do acknowledge that books and articles written on the Bank of Ghana hardly touch on the individual governors who have led the institution and the philosophies that underpinned their economic and the monetary policy decisions. This book, however, does that and will therefore go a long way to fill the gap in the body of knowledge on the economic thinking of the various governors that have transitioned through the Bank of Ghana. So on behalf of the governor, Dr. Ernest Addison, let me therefore take this opportunity to express the bank's appreciation to the author for the vision and efforts put into publishing this book. Undoubtedly, I believe this book will enhance public understanding on the workings of the central bank, particularly the much debated concept of the institutional operational independence and accountability of central banks. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, although my task here precludes the review of this book, a task which will be performed by another speaker shortly, permit me to share a few thoughts on the evolution of the monetary policy formulation and strategies mentioned in the book. I found the author's exposition on the tools of monetary policy insightful, especially the direct control and inflation targeting, expansionary and contractionary monetary policy stance, and the contemporary monetary strategies. In all of these narratives, inflation targeting is deemed the most robust monetary policy formulation strategy that has impacted positively on the objectives of central banks, including the Bank of Ghana. Even though this book could be deemed as a mirror that reflects the work of all governors of the bank since its establishment, but like the mirror, the reflection on the work of any of the governors may invariably differ depending on the reader's economic philosophy and ideology. I'm certain that the discussion on monetary policy and many other contents of the book will provide a good basis for constructive and intellectual public discourse on the author's views and assertions. Similarly, I trust that the author, being a seasoned scholar and academic, will readily respond to any constructive critique and commentary that may arise from economists, academics, and reviewers of this book. This notwithstanding, this book will serve as a useful resource for central bankers, academics, and students of economics in and outside Ghana. So I highly recommend the central banking in Ghana and the governors, institutional growth and economic development to everyone. On this note, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, invited guests, join me to congratulate the author, Mr. Ivo Ajimendua, for the successful publication and the launch of this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Opokwa-Ferry. We are also privileged to have Baroness Valerie Amos here share some remarks with us. Please let us welcome her.
President Kufuor, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, can I say what an honor it is to have been invited to participate this afternoon in the launch of this very, very important book, citing the history of Ghana's central bank and its governors, which is 65 years old. We're at a moment, I think, in global affairs, which makes this book particularly pertinent. As countries look at the best ways to achieve economic stability, and over the last few years, there have been a lot of questions asked about the role of our global financial institutions, and in particular, their impact on this continent and elsewhere, and whether they have hindered or facilitated long-term development. There's a bigger conversation which is going on about globalization and its impact. And there are many perspectives which propose that globalization has reinforced the marginalization of countries on the African continent. Now, I don't necessarily share that stark view, but I do believe very strongly that the way that the global economy has worked has not necessarily benefited countries on this continent. However, I do feel that I have walked a particular journey with Ghana over the last 20 years. As Africa Minister for the United Kingdom between 2001 and 2003, I had many conversations with the President and many in the Cabinet about the pros and cons of Ghana participating in the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, HIPIC, and whether Ghana should join. I saw the benefits, the resources that could be used to support infrastructure and social programs in a country rich in natural resources, rich in terms of its people, but heavily indebted to the United Kingdom in particular. And of course, I understood that that kind of debt goes through cycles. But I also felt very strongly that Ghana participating in that initiative would not only release resources, but in the longer term, promote greater investment. But it was a decision which took courage. But it was a courage which I felt saw benefits, as the money released went into supporting programs in Ghana's poverty reduction strategy. But since then, we've had the global financial crisis. We've seen so many conflicts continuing on this continent, including in this region, in northern Nigeria, for example, in Mali, but also further afield on the continent, looking at Sudan and South Sudan. There has also been the impact of the pandemic. So we are now in very different times. Coming from the United Kingdom, I've seen the impact of the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, and rising inflation. And Ghana, once again, heavily indebted. We have a lack of trust in our global financial architecture, despite the push for reform. It's important that we think about what reform might mean for this continent. And I think it's important that countries on this continent come together to think about the kinds of solutions you would like to see. The IMF, at its heart, very often comes up with the same core solutions, and we've all seen the way that there has been pushback against that. There seems to be a lack of differentiation of the specifics of a country's development, the importance of ongoing support to people whose lives are often precarious and who have to stitch things together to make a living. But it's also about power. We saw in 2014 China support the development of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, with China leading that bank, signaling a huge shift in the power dynamics in economies across the world, a realignment of global leadership, and a perception of a more grown-up conversation between countries led by China. The voice of African countries needs to be at the center of this conversation about reassessing and reform. Because it's not just about the architecture. It's about the power of that voice. The importance that countries on this continent, at the change that they can bring if they work together, if they identify issues of concern together and act, of course, in their national interest, but also frame a regional agenda. What this book has shown very clearly is the importance of history, the importance of thinking about how best to serve people and how best to to develop a future-looking agenda. We all have a lot to learn from reading this book, but most important, in thinking about economic policies going forward, it has so much to teach us. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Baroness Amos. I think those are very interesting reminders that you have just given us here. Please, let's put our hands together for her once again. We do have a few more remarks, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Hippolyte Fofack to also share his remarks with us.
Thank you very much, and His Excellency President Kufuor, thank you very much. And Baroness Amos, thank you. I would like to really thank the organizer for associating the African Export-Import Bank to this extremely important and timely event. Central banking in Ghana and the governor and sustainable growth and economic development is indeed a book about the history of Ghana, and it teaches us a lot about the history of Ghana, the history of economic development in Ghana, but also across the whole continent. It highlights really the multidisciplinary power of history, a discipline often neglected in this continent, and it's very good, quite frankly, to have an extremely gifted and meticulous scholar, Ivo, reminding us once again how important history is, the mother of all discipline in the process of economic development and policy making. I would like to join other speaker really in congratulating the author and thanking him for that wonderful contribution to the history of Central Bank of Ghana, but also the history of Africa. I would also like to thank the leadership of the Bank of Ghana under Dr. Ernest Addisons for really allowing such a project to go forward. It takes courage because each time when people write about you, they may not always say the thing that you like. You have to be prepared to accept them. I think it's a sense of intellectual courage, and really he took a risk. We have to thank him for that. The book is written at a time when central banks around the world have actually somehow managed to let the inflation cat out of the bag. And inflation reached the 40-year height record last year. And I think we've seen as a result of that some of the most aggressive tightening cycle ever undertaken by some of this bank. And the issue of inflation and growth trade-off, how do we bring inflation back to target without putting a hard brake on growth to create recessions, actually came up once again. But that aggressive tightening also raised another challenge, the trade-off between financial stability and price stability, as we saw with the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank earlier this year. It is very important, therefore, to look at things longer-term perspective, historical perspective, to avoid the repeat of mistakes that could be avoided that were taken in the past. I think this is why this book is so important, that long-term historical perspective. The Bank of Ghana, which is still contending with inflations above target, did not really escape that global trend that we see in the world now. This highlights how the country has become fully integrated into the global economy since its creations 65 years ago. But the challenging operating environment has also highlighted the contrast in the mandate, or I should say the implementations of central bank mandate, the dual mandates of growth and price stability, back to inflation target trade-off again. It's much easier, in my view, to aggressively raise interest rate when the labor market is tight, as we see in the US. It is less difficult to do so when unemployment rate are at Great Depression level. And that's what we have in most of the continent as we speak. And we saw that challenge in South Africa earlier this year when the Reserve Bank of South Africa was pressing on against the wishes of the ANC rising interest rates in a country where unemployment rate were at Great Depression level at 32% as we speak. The question of mandate and independence of central bank are also related, and I'm glad you brought that in the book, with monetary policy setting dictated by growth prospects and what we call policy cycle. The author cited Governor Amos and saying, central bank independence, I quote, is not possible to have in a developing country, especially on the military dictatorship regime. But my question to you, is it possible to have central bank independence under the so-called democratic regime? Another wonderful piece of history that I was looking at this morning, it's regarding the US. It's titled, The Rocky History of the Fed Independence, recounting how Richard Nixon appointed Arthur Burns as chairman of the Fed and made it clear that he wanted the Fed to keep interest rate low, particularly, this is important for you, President, in the run-up to the 1972 presidential elections. More recently, we saw how Chairman Jay Powell came under tremendous pressure from the Trump administrations and in the run-up to the US presidential elections in 2020. Quite frankly, central bank independence is a perpetual challenge, both what we call democratic regime, but also dictatorship regime, especially when we are going through economic crisis. But central bank independence in Ghana, or in most developing countries, is further complicated by what I call IMF interference, isn't it? The rise of and propagation of IMF orthodoxies, as well as the ability of IMF to draw on revolving door that you mentioned in your book, and other means, including the need for really mitigating balance of payment pressure, the hard currency, make it very difficult to actually operate independently, the central banks. Just like Kenya yesterday, Ghana had its own IMF governor about 20 years ago, Dr. Paul Akua. You call him the governor who finally came from the IMF. What a title. In this case, I think independence has often come to mean under the IMF tutelage, discussing how our economy has performed under such arrangement, taking a long historical perspective, will greatly inform, as you said, and is it in your book. But the book is also written at a time when, as you said, Baroness, global push toward a multilateralization of reserve currency and perhaps even a return to commodity-based reserve currency. We are heading toward that. This could open a new era of central banking for the Bank of Ghana, but more generally for banking across the African continent. One that will rebalance the relationship between the issuer of reserve currency, the few, and the demand of reserve currency. One that essentially, that monetary inequality has been the root cause of liquidity constraint and recurrent balance of payment crisis, driving currency gyrations. You saw the Nigerian naira, the Egyptian pound floating last year, and the risk of debt overhang, which is always looming. But the future of central banking in Africa is on the shifting geopolitical technology shift, plate, and rivalry, as well as return to commodity-based reserve currency, is another important area that we see in the book, that could actually be developed further. But I wanted to close my remark on another major point made by the author in the book, the capacity building role played by the Bank of Ghana as a first child of central banking in sub-Saharan Africa, the first child. More than helping establish other central banks across the continent, it has provided advisory services to other African regulators. I think this amazing contribution made by the Bank of Ghana is not well known across the continent. Capacity building is in the arcane of central banking. It has become something alien to the continent. This widely praised and timely piece of work by Ivor has the power to really correct that so that we have from that history a better knowledge of what we've been able to do in terms of knowledge sharing within the continent. And to correct that, and indeed to sustainably boost the confidence of African central banker at a time when there is a concerted effort to deepen integrations and move toward regional reserve currencies. I would like to close with a quote from Henry James. I quote, "It takes an endless amount of history to make even a little traditions." It takes an endless amount of history to make even a little traditions. Our great historians, Ivor, I think the historian of Bank of Ghana, or the historian of central banking in Africa, has actually set out on the path, and more seminal contribution of this nature will make central banking and African traditions to strengthen ownership of development process and policy making. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fofack. And ladies and gentlemen, we are gradually nearing the highlights of this event. Once again, this is a book launch of the book, Central Banking in Ghana and the Governess, Institutional Growth and Economic Development, written by Mr. Ivor Ajiman Dua. Let me also take the chance to remind you that this event is being streamed live on the social media platforms of the Bank of Ghana, who has made this event possible, together with the London School of Economics, Ghana Alumni Association. Reading the review that has been put together by renowned economist, Mr. Kwame Pienim here, I was struck by the concluding paragraph. Now, permit me to read. This book is not only to be read and put aside, it is to serve as a major source of reference for researchers, students, and others in academia for all manner of studies in the humanities. He also says that, and also as a policy manual for those charged with the management of the political economy of Ghana and other developing countries. Very profound. And that's also a reminder for all of us to pick copies of the book after the launch. At this point, I'd want you to help me welcome Professor of History and Development at the James Madison University in the United States of America, Professor David Owusu-Ansah, to share some brief remarks with us as well. Please put your hands together for him.
His Excellency, Baroness, ladies and gentlemen, my name is David Owusu-Ansah, teaching at James Madison University for the last 37 years. Where I was the first trained African historian. We have developed a very good program, and I'm also the author of the Ghana Historical Dictionary. The first 4 editions, the 5th one, I'm co-authoring with Edmond Abeka, and it's coming out sometime soon. However, thank you for inviting me to be here. And as I read the book, I took a look again at the dictionary, and recognize that as much as we have written on economic issues, we have really not written any much about the central bank. Historians are mentioned in the context of economics, but when you teach overseas, especially when you are one of the few scholars on Africa, you teach everything. And therefore, we have had the opportunity to teach modern Africa in economic development. And KY, I have read your chapter in John Ravenhill's work, where you mitigated the debate on structural adjustment and the debate on that. So when we do teach, the political scientists teach Africa in a way that very much centers, for example, on government policies, IMF decisions that we have not implemented well, and most often try to complain and make excuses for our predicament. So this past semester, I did a course on the theories and ideologies of development, and we read Arthur Lewis and all those individuals who have actually advised governments and the bank's policies as well. And Hippolyte, actually, I read your essay with Emmanuel on women and development, which I had the opportunity to read the draft before you guys published it. And Prof, your book is on my table. I reference it often, so yeah. I find Avo's work very, very insightful. I like it for the fact that it is not ideologically driven, nor is it framed in any theoretical framework. It is a narrative, and a narrative very well informed by the sources. And certainly, when we teach these particular courses, often when African developments have not gone well and the bank criticizes the African governments and their central banks, the idea that one gets is that nobody in the government has knowledge of development, and we just want the money to spend. I would like to mention that the debate in the book, ministers of finance, the prime ministers, formerly the presidents, formerly the prime ministers, the bank, indicates that there's a very vibrant debate in government with regards to development. And certainly when you are in the classroom, these are the things you want students to hear. That it is not a policy that came out without serious give and takes. But you remember Nkrumah reminded Arthur Lewis that he has a constituency to please. The people who voted him to office expect certain things from him. And it is the same way that J.H. Manson mentioned in 1971-72, and I quote here, emerging nations such as Ghana can expect to have a permanent balance of payment deficit. It is to fill the gap that aid is sought and capital transfers occur. The only way to keep Ghana out of this class of deficit countries is to stop development. Of course, we don't want to stop development. So what we should do is to remove ourselves from that permanent deficit countries. What we need to do is to minimize that particular deficit reasonably. That is to say, we are not spending beyond our means, and the bank, IMF often refers that, especially when Ghana is in crisis and they didn't listen to what they want to do, you were to go back to them, they're going to say, well, if only you have developed within your means, and this is a business, so you cannot ask us not to respond the way we have. We are in a very, very serious situation. Governments need to know that, and domestic funding often becomes part of the bridge to that. And certainly domestic funding, especially those who invest in bonds, must have the confidence that is going to mature and that they're going to have their money back. So what AVA has done, from my point of view, is the material that we would like to use in history classrooms, not only economic classrooms, but actually history classrooms, so students have memory of what has taken place with regards to our emergence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Owusu-Ansah. We are so grateful. I'd want to invite Professor Ernest Aite to also share some remarks with us. Please put your hands together for him.
Your Excellency, President John Ajay Kufuor, Baroness Valerie Amos, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I must say I'm extremely pleased that Ivor invited me to make a short statement at this book launch. When he mentioned this to me, he didn't tell me that it was such a huge volume that required a lot of time to go through. I agreed to speak without knowing the contents of the book. Having seen the book, I'm pleased. I'm very grateful to him for inviting me to be a part of it, because it documents for all of us the 65 years experience at the central bank. But it goes well beyond central banking. It tells us a lot about the link between the central banking and the rest of the economy. What makes it even more interesting is the fact that he brings the personal experiences of the governors and their staff and also their families into the book, which makes it extremely exciting. What I want to talk about briefly is the fact that, he also documents it partly, that central banking in Africa has changed a lot in the last 30 years, has changed a lot. And we see it in Ghana, as indeed also in other African countries. Today, we've seen the evolution, the movement away from centrally controlled banks to banks that are more and more independent. We've seen a move towards market-based determination of various rates, the management of monetary targets and exchange rates. All of these things have changed. So I think everything is much more market-based. There are, as you see in the book, elements of how we do this in this market economy, using inflation targeting, looking at various other developments that have been made possible by technology over the last decade or so. All of these are very well documented. I like the part in the book that exposes our interest in mobile banking, for example. And we've seen how in some parts of the region, the advent of mobile banking has been led by the central bank. And I'm talking here about Kenya, where the central bank was very instrumental in initiating financial inclusiveness. In other parts of the region, we've seen that things have developed, and then the central banks have followed, sometimes very well, other times not so well. So I like the way Ivor puts out many of these stories. We are today in a world where digital currency is very much on a growth path. It's growing in many places. In Africa, we hear about it. Nigeria has taken the lead in trying to understand and regulate it. Other countries are following a lot more. But there are a number of persistent challenges that we haven't addressed, despite all these improvements over the last 30 years. So today, after more than 30 years of experimenting, we have a situation where the gap between, or the spread between deposit and lending rates remains extremely high. It's something that for over 30 years we've been trying to resolve, we haven't been able to. And it's a reflection of the structure, not simply of the central bank, but of the entire banking system. Why have we failed to address the most obvious and the most difficult challenge that our manufacturers face, our farmers face, our service providers face? The widespread between lending and depository. Why is it so difficult? It's a structural issue, clearly. Today, we see throughout the region declining profitability of banking for clear structural reasons. One of the things that Hippolyte spoke about and others have spoken about today is the central bank independence. Are we happy with what we have? I like this presentation in the book where he provides more or less the personal experiences of the governors from the BMQ Harm. I'm talking about the Ghanaians from Harm through to today's Ernest Addison. One of the things that struck me was how we've always spoken about the need for independence. I've been to several meetings at the Ministry of Finance and other places where we spoke about the need for central bank independence and fought for it and have changed the laws and so on. And yet, we remain quite ambiguous in terms of how we relate to central bank independence. Is it giving us enough independence? Do the central bank governors have enough independence to do what they want to do? Of course, the jury is still out on that. One thing that comes out quite clearly is that today, the influence of ideology on how decisions are made is gone. When we began the structural adjustment and all the reforms that went with it, a lot of the debate disappeared. So we are all today more or less moved from the right, left to the right, and now we try to do various things in that small corner. The one thing that is missing, in my view, has been the absence of debate. So while we are all on the right, there's no debate about the effectiveness of one thing or the other. And that is probably what we need to think about. So the independence is important. By using the independence to foster debate that will bring new knowledge, new ideas into how to solve problems like the wide spread between lending and deposit rates. Without debate, it's not going to happen. So I applaud the Central Bank of Ghana for allowing this book to be written. I'm extremely pleased with the trends that we've seen. If we are doing research today on banking in Ghana, it's a lot easier than it was for us in the mid-'80s. In those years, in the mid-'80s, if you wanted to write anything about the economy of Ghana, and you went to Bank of Ghana, you received what they called provisional data. And you could be sure that 3 months after you started using it for your research, they will revise it. And it will be extremely, very different from what was given to you before. So you have to start your work all over again. As a result of capacity building, I'm very pleased to see the quality of personnel that you have at the central bank. It has improved significantly. So they are able to produce reports that you can meaningfully use for research. You can meaningfully use for policy making. I'm very pleased with the type of leadership that you find there. It has been like this for a number of years. But the central bank has done very well. It has done much better than most Ghanaian public institutions in the last 3 decades. It has done much, much better, reformed itself. What it needs to do is open the door for more debates. Thank you very much.
Now praise we great and famous men, the fathers named in story, and praise the Lord who now as then reveals in man his glory. Praise we the wise and brave and strong, who graced their generation, who helped the right and fought the wrong, and made our folk a nation. I'd like to invite Baroness Amos to officially launch the book, if you may. Please, let's put our hands together for Baroness Amos.
Thank you very much. Ivor has given me the honor of officially launching the book. Ivor, I think you should be here with me. You did all the hard work. This wonderful book is officially launched. Thank you all. Ivor won't say this. Go out and buy it.
Thank you very much, Baroness Amos. And yes, I do add my voice to that. There are so many copies of this book right outside, so each and every one of us should please make it a point to pick up a copy. Now, this 353-page book was graciously put together, very well put together, for those of us who have seen copies, by Digger Books Ghana Limited. And the CEO of Digger Books Ghana Limited, Mr. Fred Labi, is here with us. I'd like to invite him to share some words with us. Please put your hands together for him.
His Excellency, the President, Baroness, Amos, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a great privilege to be able to present DigiBooks as the publishers of this great book, Central Banking in Ghana and the Governance, Institutional Growth, and Economic Development by Professor Awa Ajimendua. I'd like to thank Prof for giving DigiBooks the opportunity to publish his book. It's been a great pleasure working with you through the conception, birth, and now the adoring of this very well-chronicled history book. We have much enjoyed your dedication to excellence and attention to detail through the whole period we work together. We hope our partnership shall continue well into the future so that we shall do more books. I also like to thank my wife and the team from DigiBooks for all the hard work and dedication to ensuring that this publication is such a great success. We at DigiBooks are specialists in print-on-demand publishing. We are dedicated to supporting authors through the life cycle of the book development, from conception, editing, book design, launch, and distribution. We have a unique capability to develop a prototype of your actual publication and work with you, the author, until the book is finished and printed at large scale. Other titles we publish include various memoirs, academic journals, biographies, and autobiographies. We are currently the largest publisher for the University of Ghana Legon Reader Series. DigiBooks would like to be your publisher of choice. We are dedicated to continuing driving seeking funds, contributions to Africa and Africa's literary wealth. If you have an unpublished book ready to be published, we will be happy to collaborate with you to turn your dream into a reality. Books launched today will be available in all good bookshops in the country. These are listed in the program booklet. In Accra, you can get them from Kingdom Bookshop at Legon, Akonji, Vida Bookshop, Blue Nice Bookshop at Sphinx, Kotuka International Airport, Terminal 2, EPB Bookshops at Legon Hall. In Kumasi, you can get it to buy at Kingdom Bookshop at Kenya NUST and at the Golden Tulip Hotel, and the Blue Night Bookshop at Kumasi Airport within lunch. You can also buy online from the publisher's website and from amazon.co.uk and amazon.com. There's a plan to do e-book version to capture the iPad and Kindle markets. Thank you for coming to support the adoring of this book, must-read historical book. Do not leave without grabbing the book for yourselves, friends, and the friends' friends. Books will be available at sale at the door. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Labi. So yes, please feel free to see Mr. Labi for the printing of all your memoirs. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings to an end the first part of this event. Please do not be in a rush to go. After here, there are some drinks, bits and pieces to bite on. networking, get to know those who have come here to support the launch of this book, and most importantly, please buy a copy of this very wonderful book. At this point in time, on behalf of our author here, Mr. Ivor Ajimandua, on behalf of the Bank of Ghana, and of course, the London School of Economics and Political Science, Ghana Alumni Association, I'd like to thank each and every one of us for having taken time off our extremely busy schedules to have come to support Mr. Ivor Ajimandua on the launch of his book, Central Banking in Ghana and the Governance, Institutional Growth and Economic Development. Our distinguished personalities here have said a lot about this book, so I need not bore you with any more talk. Thank you very much for having made it. Congratulations once again, Ivor. Please let us put our hands together for Mr. Ivor Ajimandua. Mr. Fred Labi, CEO of Digi Books, has told us where we can also get copies of the book in case you are unable to buy one today. Thank you, and do enjoy the rest of your evening. God bless us all. Please, we will take some group photographs. Our photographers, if you can please get closer.